On January 17, 1991, Iraqi radar operators stared at their screens in confusion. They could hear explosions tearing through downtown Baghdad. They knew American aircraft were attacking, but their radars showed nothing. Empty sky. Thousands of anti-aircraft rounds streaked into the darkness, tracer fire crisscrossing the night in every direction, hitting nothing. Somewhere above them, completely invisible, American pilots were methodically destroying every command bunker, every communication center, every air defense node that was supposed to protect the Iraqi capital. The Iraqis never saw what hit them. This is the story of the Lockheed F-117 Nighthawk, an aircraft with no radar, no missiles, no afterburner, no speed, an aircraft so aerodynamically unstable that without computers constantly adjusting its controls, it would tumble out of the sky in less than half a second. An aircraft that looked so strange, so alien, that when pilots first saw it, some genuinely asked if it had been recovered from a UFO crash site. They called it the Wobblin Goblin. And I have to tell you, the more I researched this aircraft, the more I realized that everything I thought I knew about air combat was wrong. Because this ugly, slow, defenseless aircraft did something no plane had ever done before. It made radar, the technology that had dominated aerial warfare since World War II, essentially useless. That single achievement terrified Soviet generals more than any nuclear missile ever could. Because if American aircraft could fly through the most sophisticated air defense networks in the world, completely undetected, then every assumption the Soviet Union had made about defending its territory, every billion rubles spent on surface-to-air missiles and radar installations, every strategic calculation about the balance of power, all of it became worthless overnight. Before we dive deep into this extraordinary story, if you find this kind of content fascinating, I'd really appreciate it if you hit that subscribe button and give this video a like. It helps the channel grow and allows me to keep bringing you these in-depth explorations of military aviation history.
Now, let's get into it. To understand why the F-117 was designed the way it was, you need to understand a problem that had been haunting American military planners since the skies over North Vietnam.
During the Vietnam War, the United States lost nearly 1,000 aircraft to enemy fire. And while many of those losses came from conventional anti-aircraft guns, the introduction of Soviet-made SA-2 guideline missiles changed everything. These missiles were radar-guided, meaning they could track aircraft at distances and altitudes where human gunners couldn't even see them. American pilots developed tactics to evade these missiles. They used electronic jamming. They flew at extremely low altitudes where radar couldn't track them. They attacked radar sites directly in what they called wild weasel missions. But every countermeasure had a countermeasure. And the fundamental problem remained. If radar could see you, missiles could kill you. By the early 1970s, Soviet air defense technology had advanced dramatically. The SA-6 gainful missile system, which the Soviets exported to Egypt and Syria, proved devastatingly effective during the Yom Kippur War of 1973. In the first few days of that conflict, Israeli aircraft losses were catastrophic. I want you to understand what this meant. Israel had some of the best pilots in the world, flying some of the most advanced Western aircraft available, and they were being shot down at rates that would have made sustained air operations impossible. In the first 3 days alone, Israel lost over 50 aircraft. The message was clear. Flying into a modern, integrated air defense system was practically suicide. And here's what really worried American planners. The Soviets had built the most extensive air defense network in human history. Thousands of radar installations, thousands of missile launchers, thousands of anti-aircraft guns, all linked together in a coordinated system called the Voiska PVO, which was actually its own separate branch of the Soviet military, with its own command structure, its own equipment, and its own strategic doctrine. If war ever broke out in Europe, American pilots would be flying into a wall of radar-guided death. So the question became, how do you survive in that environment? You could try to overwhelm the defenses with sheer numbers, but that meant accepting massive casualties losses that might break the will of democratic nations to continue fighting. You could try to jam the radar. But jamming technology and radar technology were locked in an endless arms race with neither side ever gaining permanent advantage. Could fly at extremely low altitudes, below radar coverage, but that made you vulnerable to anti-aircraft guns and short-range missiles, and it was exhausting for pilots and brutal on aircraft. None of these solutions were satisfactory. What American planners really wanted was something that seemed impossible. They wanted an aircraft that radar simply couldn't see. Now, the idea of reducing an aircraft's radar signature wasn't new. Engineers had understood the basic principles since the 1940s. Radar works by bouncing radio waves off objects and detecting the reflections. The bigger and more reflective the object, the stronger the return signal. So in theory, if you could make an aircraft smaller and less reflective, it would be harder to detect. But in practice, this was incredibly difficult. Aircraft needed wings to fly, and wings were excellent radar reflectors. They needed engines, and engine intakes were like perfect radar mirrors. They needed cockpits, and glass canopies reflected radar beautifully. Every practical requirement of flight seemed to contradict the requirements of radar and visibility. Various attempts had been made to reduce radar signatures. The SR-71 Blackbird incorporated some stealth features, including radar-absorbing materials and carefully shaped engine inlets. The B-1 bomber program included signature reduction in its design goals. But these were incremental improvements, not revolutionary changes. The aircraft were still clearly visible on radar, somewhat less visible than they might otherwise have been. What happened next is one of the most remarkable ironies in aviation history. And it started with a Soviet scientist named Pyotr Ufimtsev. In 1962, Ufimtsev published a paper with the incredibly dry title, Method of Edge Waves in the Physical Theory of Diffraction. The paper dealt with the mathematical prediction of how electromagnetic waves, including radar waves, would scatter when they hit objects of various shapes. Ufimtsev wasn't thinking about stealth aircraft when he wrote this. He was doing pure theoretical physics, the kind of abstract mathematical work that seemed to have no practical application. And the Soviet military apparently didn't recognize the implications of his work because they allowed it to be published openly in an academic journal. It was, after all, just equations. Eventually, that paper was translated into English and ended up in the library of the Foreign Technology Division at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. And there it sat, unread and unappreciated, gathering dust for over a decade, until a Lockheed engineer named Denny Overholser happened to find it. What Overholser realized was extraordinary. Ufimtsev's equations provided a way to precisely calculate how radar waves would reflect off complex shapes. Until then, predicting radar reflections from anything other than simple geometric forms, spheres, cylinders, flat plates, had been essentially impossible, requiring expensive and time-consuming physical testing. But with Ufimtsev's mathematics, you could design a shape on paper and calculate exactly how visible it would be to radar before you've ever built anything. The Soviets had given away the keys to their own destruction, and they didn't even know it. Overholser took this idea to his boss at Lockheed's legendary Skunk Works division, a brilliant and unconventional engineer named Ben Rich, and what he proposed was radical. Instead of trying to make a conventional aircraft slightly less visible, what if they designed an aircraft whose shape was specifically optimized to deflect radar waves away from their source? What if invisibility to radar was the primary design requirement and everything else, speed, maneuverability, payload, was secondary? Rich was intrigued but skeptical. He asked Overholser how small a radar signature they could theoretically achieve. The answer stunned him. Overholser believed they could make an aircraft that would appear on radar as no larger than a ball bearing. An object weighing several tons with a wingspan of over 40 feet would be essentially invisible. Rich paused for a moment. Then he replied, "Well, Denis, if we can do that, we'll make Lockheed $1 billion. What neither man knew at the time was that they would make Lockheed many billions of dollars and fundamentally transform aerial warfare in the process. The program that resulted disappeared into a black hole of classification, so deep that the men who built it couldn't acknowledge its existence to their own families. They drove to work before dawn and came home after dark. Their neighbors thought they were accountants. The project was initially called Have Blue, and it was so secret that even most people at Lockheed didn't know it existed. The team worked in a heavily guarded facility at the edge of a dry lake bed in the Nevada desert, a place that would later become famous as Area 51. They were designing something that had never existed before, and they were doing it with the knowledge that if they failed, the Soviet Union would maintain its air defense superiority, and American pilots would continue to die in any future conflict. The shape they eventually developed was unlike anything in aviation history. Because UFMC's equations worked best with flat surfaces, the aircraft was covered in faceted panels like a diamond or cut gemstone. This gave it an angular pyramidal appearance that looked more like abstract sculpture than an airplane. Every angle was calculated with mathematical precision to reflect radar waves away at predictable angles away from the transmitter rather than back toward it. There were no curved surfaces, no right angles, nothing that would create a strong radar return. The edges of the wings and tail were aligned at specific angles that would scatter radar energy in directions where receivers weren't located. The result was an aircraft that violated almost every principle of conventional aerodynamic design. It wasn't streamlined. It wasn't elegant. It wasn't beautiful in any traditional sense. In fact, when engineers ran the first computer simulations, the models predicted it would be unflyable. The shape was so inherently unstable that no human pilot could possibly control it using conventional means. This is where another technological revolution came into play. The aircraft would be controlled by a quadruple redundant fly-by-wire computer system that would make constant adjustments to the control surfaces hundreds of times per second to keep it stable. The pilot would tell the computer what he wanted the aircraft to do, and the computer would figure out how to make that happen without the aircraft tumbling out of control. I want you to appreciate how revolutionary this was. The engineers were deliberately designing an aircraft that couldn't fly in any conventional sense, trusting that computers would make it flyable. If the computers failed, the pilot had no chance. There was no manual backup, no possibility of controlling the aircraft through skill alone. The test pilots who volunteered to fly it knew that a computer malfunction meant certain death. This was a complete departure from the entire history of aviation, where aircraft were designed to be inherently stable, and pilots were trained to fly them manually. Have Blue represented a fundamental shift in philosophy, and the machine would no longer be designed around the limits of human control. Human control would be mediated through computers that could handle complexity beyond human capability. To Have Blue prototypes were built in total secrecy. The first flight took place in December 1977, with test pilot Bill Park at the controls. Park later described the experience as flying a grand piano. The aircraft was sluggish, unresponsive, and fought him at every turn, but it flew, and the radar results exceeded all expectations. During testing, the prototypes were tracked by the most sophisticated radar systems the United States possessed, and they frequently disappeared from screens entirely. On one famous occasion, the radar signature of the aircraft was smaller than the return from a metal ball bearing. On another test, the radar tracked a flock of birds more easily than it tracked the aircraft. The stealth concept worked. It worked better than anyone had dared hope. But the Have Blue prototypes were just proof of concept vehicles. They were too small to carry any useful weapons payload, and they were fragile, hand-built machines unsuitable for operational service. Both prototypes eventually crashed during testing, one due to a landing gear failure, the other to a flight control malfunction. Bill Park survived his crash, ejecting safely. The second pilot, Lieutenant Colonel Ken Dyson, also survived, though his aircraft was completely destroyed. What was needed now was a production aircraft that could actually go to war. This became the F-117 Nighthawk, though that designation itself reveals something interesting about the program. The F in F-117 stands for fighter, but the aircraft was never designed to be a fighter in any meaningful sense. It had no air-to-air capability whatsoever. It couldn't dogfight, couldn't engage enemy aircraft. It couldn't even defend itself if attacked. It was purely an attack aircraft designed to deliver precision-guided bombs against high-value ground targets. So why was it called a fighter? The official explanation has varied over the years, but I believe it was primarily a combination of security considerations and pilot recruitment. Fighter pilots were generally considered the elite of the Air Force, and attracting top talent to a secret program was easier if you were offering them a fighter assignment rather than an attack or bomber assignment. The best pilots wanted to fly fighters. Calling it a fighter got you the best pilots. The 117 designation was equally unusual, as it didn't fit into any standard numbering sequence. Air Force fighters of that era were numbered in the teens and 20s, F-14, F-15, F-16, F-18. The 117 designation may have been chosen specifically to confuse Soviet intelligence analysts trying to track American aircraft development programs, or it may have connected to earlier classified projects. The true reason remains disputed. The F-117A entered service in October 1983, but it remained completely secret until November 1988, for 5 years. An entire squadron of operational stealth aircraft flew missions in total darkness, literally and figuratively. The aircraft only flew at night to prevent visual detection. Pilots would take off after sunset and land before dawn. During daylight hours, the aircraft were kept inside special hangars with climate control to protect their sensitive, radar-absorbing coatings. Guards patrolled constantly. Overhead, satellites passed with predictable regularity, and flight operations would pause whenever Soviet reconnaissance satellites were in position to photograph the base. The entire program was classified at a level where even acknowledging its existence was a federal crime. Pilots were forbidden from telling their families what they flew. When Major Ross Mulhare crashed his F-117 into a mountainside in July 1986, becoming the first Nighthawk pilot killed in the line of duty, the Air Force issued a cover story claiming it was an A-7 Corsair accident. His family couldn't be told the truth. His sacrifice couldn't be publicly acknowledged. Even his headstone couldn't reveal what he actually flew. This secrecy created a unique culture among the men who flew and maintained the Nighthawk. They called themselves bandits, and each pilot was assigned a bandit number based on when they joined the program. They developed their own tactics, their own traditions, their own way of doing things, all in total isolation from the rest of the Air Force. They couldn't rely on the traditional strengths of fighter pilots: speed, maneuverability, and aggressive tactics. Instead, they had to be methodical, precise, and patient. A successful F-117 mission wasn't about outflying the enemy. It was about outsmarting them getting in, hitting the target, and getting out before anyone knew you were there. Let me explain what made the F-117 so remarkable from a tactical standpoint by first explaining what it couldn't do. First, it had no radar. This might seem strange for a military aircraft, especially one that operated exclusively at night. How do you find your targets without radar? How do you navigate? How do you avoid obstacles? The answer is that radar would have given away the aircraft's position. Radar works by emitting radio waves, and any emissions can potentially be detected by an enemy with the right receivers. A stealth aircraft that radiated energy would be announcing its presence to anyone listening. So the F-117 flew completely passively. It received information but didn't transmit anything. For navigation and targeting, the aircraft relied on an infrared system called IRADS, the Infrared Acquisition and Designation System. This allowed the pilot to see targets at night using thermal imaging and to designate targets for laser-guided bombs. The system was remarkably sophisticated for its time, but it had significant limitations compared to radar. Its range was shorter. It was affected by weather conditions. Clouds, rain, and humidity could degrade its performance significantly, and it required the pilot to maintain steady, level flight during the final moments of an attack to keep the laser precisely on target. This last requirement made the F-117 vulnerable during the critical seconds before weapon release. The pilot couldn't maneuver, couldn't evade, couldn't do anything except hold the aircraft rock steady while the laser guided the bomb to impact. If an enemy happened to detect the aircraft during those moments, the pilot was defenseless. Second, the F-117 had no guns, not even a small cannon for self-defense. This was simply a weight and space consideration. Every pound devoted to guns and ammunition was a pound that couldn't be devoted to stealth features or bomb load. And since the aircraft's entire survival strategy was based on not being detected in the first place, guns seemed unnecessary. If an enemy fighter ever got close enough to shoot at an F-117, something had already gone catastrophically wrong. The pilot's best response was to run and hide in the darkness, not to fight. Third, the F-117 was slow. Its maximum speed was around 617 miles per hour, significantly slower than most fighters of its era and barely supersonic, even in a dive. It couldn't use afterburner because the hot exhaust gases would create a massive infrared signature, making the aircraft visible to heat-seeking sensors and infrared detection systems. The engines were buried deep inside the fuselage with special exhausts designed to mix cool air with the hot gases, dispersing them before they left the aircraft. This limited thrust and therefore limited speed. But speed wasn't the point. Invisibility was the point. Fourth, the F-117's bomb load was modest by attack aircraft standards. Its internal weapons bay could carry only 2 bombs, typically 2,000-pound laser-guided bombs like the GBU-10 or GBU-27. Compare this to an F-15E, Strike Eagle, which could carry over 23,000 pounds of ordnance on external hardpoints. The F-117 couldn't deliver massive amounts of firepower. What it could do was deliver the bombs exactly on target through defenses that would have destroyed any other aircraft. Quality over quantity, precision over volume. Fifth, and this is something often overlooked, the F-117 had limited range and endurance compared to many other strike aircraft. Its fuel-efficient but low-thrust engines and its aerodynamically compromised shape meant it burned fuel at a significant rate relative to the distance it could cover. This meant extensive tanker support was required for any mission of meaningful range. Planning an F-117 strike required careful coordination of aerial refueling, and the aircraft often had to fly circuitous routes to avoid radar coverage, further increasing fuel consumption. Given all these limitations, you might wonder how the F-117 was supposed to be effective in actual combat. The answer lies in understanding what it was designed to do. The F-117 wasn't meant to win wars by itself. It was meant to kick down the door. In conventional air warfare, attacking a heavily defended target requires what's called a strike package. This is a coordinated formation of many different aircraft, each with a specific role. You need aircraft to jam enemy radar electronic warfare platforms like the EF-111 Raven. You need aircraft to attack the radar sites directly and suppress enemy air defenses. Wild weasel aircraft like the F-4G. You need fighter aircraft to protect the bombers from enemy interceptors. You need the bombers themselves to hit the target. You need tanker aircraft to refuel everyone along the way. A major strike against a well-defended target might involve dozens or even hundreds of aircraft, with all the complexity, coordination problems, and potential for casualties that implies. The more aircraft involved, the more chances for something to go wrong. The F-117 could do it alone. A single aircraft could penetrate the most sophisticated air defenses in the world, destroy a critical target with precision weapons, and return home all without being detected. No jamming aircraft needed, no defense suppression aircraft needed, no fighter escort needed, just 1 plane, 1 pilot, and 2 bombs. In the opening hours of a conflict, F-117s would strike the most critical and heavily defended targets, the ones that other aircraft couldn't safely attack. Command and control bunkers, air defense headquarters, key communication nodes, radar installations, leadership shelters. By destroying these targets first, the F-117 would create gaps in the enemy's defensive network gaps that conventional aircraft could then exploit. This concept came to be called effects-based operations, and it represented a significant evolution in air power theory. Instead of trying to destroy everything, we focused on destroying the things that mattered most, the nodes that held the enemy's military system together. A successful strike on an enemy's command center might be worth more than 100 strikes on individual military units, because it would leave those units blind, deaf, and paralyzed. The F-117's ability to guarantee the destruction of these critical targets, regardless of how heavily defended they were, gave it strategic importance far beyond what its modest bomb load might suggest. The F-117 first saw combat during Operation Just Cause, the American invasion of Panama in December 1989. 2 aircraft, piloted by Major Greg Feist and Captain Dale Zelko, were tasked with attacking the Rio Hato military airfield. The mission was unusual and controversial, rather than destroying enemy forces. The F-117s were supposed to drop bombs near the barracks of the Panamanian Defense Forces to stun and disorient the troops without killing them. The idea was that The shock and terror of precision bombs exploding nearby would paralyze the defenders, allowing Army Rangers to land and secure the airfield with minimal casualties on both sides. The mission didn't go entirely as planned. Weather conditions and last-minute changes to the attack timing created confusion. There were questions afterward about whether the bombs landed precisely where intended. But the F-117s themselves performed flawlessly, penetrating Panamanian airspace without being detected and delivering their weapons on target. More importantly, the mission proved the aircraft could operate in real combat conditions. The theories had been validated. The technology worked. But Panama was a small operation against a weak adversary with minimal air defenses. The true test was yet to come. On January 17, 1991, the F-117 finally faced the challenge it had been designed for. Operation Desert Storm opened with the most sophisticated and heavily defended air campaign target since Vietnam, downtown Baghdad. Iraqi air defenses were among the most formidable in the world outside the Soviet Union itself. The Iraqis had hundreds of radars, early warning systems, target acquisition radars, fire control radars, all linked in an integrated network. They had hundreds of surface-to-air missile systems, including SA-2 South, SA-3 South, SA-6 South, and French-made Roland missiles. They had thousands of anti-aircraft guns, including radar-guided ZSU-234 Shilka systems. They had been preparing for American attack for 5 months. Their systems were manned, calibrated, and ready. And they never saw the F-117s coming. Major Greg Fista, same pilot who had flown the first combat mission over Panama, the first wave of attacks against Baghdad. His target was the Iraqi Air Force's Sector Operations Center, a critical node in their air defense network. As Feist approached Baghdad, he could see the city lit up below him. The Iraqis weren't blacked out. They were confident in their defenses. He released his bombs. Moments later, explosions tore through the operations center, and then chaos erupted across the city. Anti-aircraft fire filled the sky, thousands of rounds, tracer fire crisscrossing in every direction, illuminating the darkness like a deadly fireworks display. But the Iraqis were shooting blind. Their radars showed nothing. They had no idea where the aircraft were, how many there were, or where they would strike next. They fired in patterns in hopes that sheer volume of fire might hit something. It didn't work. Television cameras broadcast the images live around the world. Viewers watched in amazement as Baghdad's defenses lit up the sky, firing furiously at invisible attackers. CNN reporter Peter Arnett, broadcasting from the Al Rushid Hotel, described the scene as the center of the city exploding around him while Iraqi gunners fired at phantoms. Throughout that first night, F-117s struck target after target. Communications centers, command bunkers, government ministries, air defense nodes, the AT&T building, which served as Iraq's primary telecommunications hub, a presidential palace. Target was hit with precision weapons, each bomb finding its mark. Not a single F-117 was hit. Throughout Desert Storm, F-117s flew 1,271. Combat sorts only 2% of the total sorties flown during the war, but they struck over 40% of the strategic targets. They attacked the most heavily defended sites in Iraq, night after night, and not a single aircraft was lost. Not one was even seriously damaged. This was unprecedented in the history of air warfare. During World War II, bombing raids over Germany sometimes suffered loss rates of 10% or higher. During Vietnam, attacking heavily defended targets around Hanoi and Haiphong meant accepting that some aircraft wouldn't come back. Even with precision weapons and electronic warfare support, conventional aircraft faced significant risk against integrated air defenses. The F-117 had changed the equation entirely. Colonel Alton Whitley, who commanded F-117 operations during Desert Storm, later described the aircraft's impact. "We owned the night. The Iraqis knew something was hitting them, but they never figured out what or where it was coming from. But I want to be careful not to present the F-117 as some kind of invincible superweapon, because it wasn't. Its success in Desert Storm was the result of careful planning, excellent intelligence, and an enemy whose air defense system, while extensive, was ultimately based on 1970s Soviet technology. The F-117 had been optimized to defeat that specific threat. Against a more sophisticated adversary or one who adapted their tactics, the results might be different. On March 27, 1999, Lieutenant Colonel Dale Zelko was flying an F-117 over Serbia during Operation Allied Force. It was his second tour in the Nighthawk and his third overall combat deployment. Zelko was Bandit number 52, a veteran stealth pilot with hundreds of hours in the cockpit of the world's most secret aircraft. The mission seemed routine. NATO aircraft had been striking Serbian targets for several days, and the F-117s had operated with impunity, just as they had over Baghdad 8 years earlier. Serbian air defenses were older and less capable than Iraq's had been. Intelligence suggested the threat was minimal. But Colonel Zoltan Dani, commanding the 250th Air Defense Missile Brigade, had been studying NATO's tactics, and he had developed an unconventional approach to finding aircraft that his radars couldn't see. Dani modified his SA-3 Goa missile battery's radar to operate on longer wavelengths, less precise, but potentially more effective against stealth aircraft at close range. He positioned human observers with binoculars and telephones around the probable flight paths. He studied the patterns of NATO air operations when aircraft took off, what routes they flew, how they approached their targets. He noticed something that NATO planners had overlooked. The F-117s were flying similar routes to their targets at similar times, night after night. They had become predictable. And predictability is the enemy of stealth. Dani positioned his battery along the flight path he calculated the stealth aircraft would use, and he waited. At approximately 8:15 p.m. local time, Dani's radar got a brief return, probably from Zelko's F-117 opening its bomb bay doors, which momentarily increased its radar signature. It was enough. Dani launched 2 missiles. Zelko saw the missiles coming. There was nothing he could do. The F-117 had no defensive systems, no countermeasures, no way to evade. He watched the missiles close the distance. Now, the first missile detonated close enough to send shrapnel tearing through his aircraft. The F-117 shuddered, then began to disintegrate around him. Zelko ejected into the freezing night air over hostile territory. He landed in Serbian farmland, behind enemy lines, with hostile forces already searching for him. For the next 8 hours, he evaded capture, hiding in drainage ditches and crawling through muddy fields, using his survival training to stay one step ahead of the search parties. Finally, an American rescue helicopter extracted him in a dramatic nighttime operation. The aircraft was completely destroyed. Pieces of it were recovered by Serbian forces and, according to multiple intelligence reports, shared with Russian and Chinese analysts. The secrets of American stealth technology were suddenly available for study by America's rivals. Within years, both nations would begin developing their own stealth aircraft programs. The shootdown shocked the Air Force. How had an obsolete missile system from the 1960s brought down America's most advanced stealth aircraft? The answer reveals important truths about the limits of technology. Stealth is not invisibility. It's a reduction in detectability, a stacking of the odds in your favor, but not a guarantee of safety. The F-117's radar cross-section was small, but it wasn't zero. Under certain conditions, certain angles, certain frequencies, certain moments like bomb bay doors opening, it could be detected. More importantly, the Serbians hadn't defeated stealth technology with better technology. They had defeated it with better thinking. Human intelligence, tactical creativity, and careful observation had overcome a massive technological advantage. Years later, Colonel Dani met with Colonel Zelko. The two former enemies became friends. Connected by their shared experience of that night, Dani reportedly told Zelko, "I'm sorry for shooting you down. I was just doing my job." Zelko responded that he understood they had both been soldiers following orders. The two men have since appeared together at aviation events, a remarkable example of reconciliation between warriors. The F-117 continued in service after Serbia, including during the 2003 invasion of Iraq, where it again performed well against Iraqi air defenses. But by this point, the aircraft was showing its age. It had been designed in the 1970s, using 1970s technology. Its stealth characteristics, while revolutionary for their time, had been surpassed by newer aircraft like the F-2 Raptor and B-2 Spirit. Its avionics were outdated. The cockpit displays and mission computers were primitive by modern standards. Its maintenance requirements were enormous, with the radar-absorbing coatings requiring constant attention. Each aircraft required over 50 hours of maintenance for every hour of flight time, and the strategic environment had changed. The Soviet Union, the adversary, the F-117, had been designed to defeat, no longer existed. The massive, integrated air defense networks that had terrified NATO planners throughout the Cold War had largely been dismantled or allowed to decay. The Air Force made the decision to retire the F-117 in 2008. After 25 years of operational service, but the retirement was unusual. Rather than being sent to the boneyard at Davis-Monthan Air Force Base like most retired aircraft, the F-117s were placed in Type 1000 storage, a special category that keeps aircraft in flyable condition. Some of their stealth coatings were removed, but the aircraft themselves remained intact. And occasionally, aviation enthusiasts and photographers report seeing strange, angular shapes in the skies over the Nevada desert aircraft that officially don't fly anymore, conducting missions that officially don't happen, keeping secrets that may never be revealed. The F-117 Nighthawk was more than just an aircraft. It was a proof of concept that changed the world. For the F-117 air power was fundamentally about attrition. To achieve air superiority, you had to be willing to accept losses. Pilots would die. Aircraft would be destroyed. The question was whether you could sustain those losses longer than your enemy could. Every war plan, every strategic calculation, every budget allocation assumed that air operations would be costly in blood and machines. Stealth changed that equation fundamentally. If your aircraft can't be targeted, they can't be shot down. If they can't be shot down, you don't have to accept losses. Air operations become sustainable indefinitely, regardless of enemy defenses. This had profound strategic implications far beyond any single aircraft or any single war. During the Cold War, NATO war plans assumed that in a conventional conflict with the Soviet Union, air losses would be catastrophic. Some estimates suggested that NATO tactical air forces would be largely destroyed within 2 weeks of combat. This made nuclear escalation seem almost inevitable because if conventional forces couldn't hold, what option remained except nuclear weapons? Stealth offered a way out of that trap. If American aircraft could penetrate Soviet defenses without being destroyed, conventional options remained viable. The pressure to escalate to nuclear weapons was reduced. Paradoxically, stealth technology may have made nuclear war less likely not because it prevented conflict, but because it made conventional conflict more survivable. On the other side of the equation, stealth forced the Soviet Union to confront the inadequacy of their defensive strategy. They had built their entire military posture around the ability to defend Soviet territory against American air attack. They had spent billions of rubles on radars, missiles, interceptors, and the personnel to operate them. The Vojska PVO consumed perhaps 15% of their entire military budget, and stealth threatened to make all of it useless. Some historians have argued that the strain of trying to respond to American technological advances, including stealth, contributed to the economic collapse of the Soviet Union. They simply couldn't afford to keep up. Every dollar America spent on stealth forced the Soviets to spend many dollars trying to counter it. And those were dollars they didn't have. The F-117 proved that stealth could be achieved at reasonable cost. The entire program development and 59 production aircraft cost about $6 billion. Compare that to the B-2 Spirit, where a single aircraft costs over $2 billion and only 21 were ever built. The F-117 demonstrated that stealth wasn't just an exotic curiosity for unlimited budgets. It was a practical capability that could be fielded in meaningful numbers. Without the F-117, there might never have been a B-2, or an F-22 Raptor, or an F-35 Lightning II. It was the proof of concept that made everything else possible. The principles the F-117 demonstrated have since spread around the world. China has developed stealth fighters, the J-20 and FC-31. Russia has the Su-57 even. Countries without fifth-generation stealth fighters are incorporating low-observable features into their newer aircraft designs. The genie is out of the bottle. Stealth is no longer an American monopoly, and the advantages it once provided are diminishing as the technology spreads. This raises interesting questions about the future of air combat. If everyone has stealth, does anyone have an advantage? The answer, I think, is that air warfare is entering a new phase, where detection and targeting become the central challenges rather than penetration of defenses. Advanced radars operating on multiple frequencies, infrared search and track systems, networked sensors that share data across platforms, and artificial intelligence that can correlate faint signals. All of these are being developed specifically to find and track stealth aircraft. The technological competition continues, just as it always has. The F-117 broke the old paradigm, but a new paradigm is already emerging. The cycle of measure and countermeasure never ends. I want to close with some reflections on what the F-117 story teaches us, lessons that extend beyond military aviation. The first lesson is about asymmetric thinking. The F-117 was not designed to be the best at any traditional measure of aircraft performance. It wasn't the fastest, wasn't the most maneuverable, wasn't the longest range or the most heavily armed, but it was the best at one thing: not being seen. That single advantage was so significant that it outweighed all the traditional metrics. Sometimes the path to victory isn't being better at the existing game, it's changing the game entirely. The second lesson is about challenging assumptions. The entire military aviation establishment had assumed that aircraft needed to be fast, maneuverable, and well-armed to survive in combat. These assumptions were so deeply embedded that they seemed like laws of nature. The F-117 challenged every one of them. It survived not by outfighting the enemy, but by being invisible to them. Progress often requires questioning the assumptions that everyone else takes for granted. The third lesson is about the relationship between technology and tactics. The F-117's stealth technology was revolutionary, but technology alone didn't make it effective. The tactics developed for stealth aircraft, the careful route planning, the night-only operations, the precise timing, the intelligence preparation, these were essential to realizing the technology's potential. And as Serbia proved, even revolutionary technology can be defeated by a determined and clever adversary using inferior equipment but superior thinking. Technology provides advantages, but humans determine how those advantages are used. The fourth lesson is about secrecy and surprise. The F-117 was kept secret for 5 years after it became operational, and that secrecy was itself a strategic asset. Soviet planners knew American stealth aircraft might exist, but they didn't know their capabilities or how to counter them. This uncertainty forced them to prepare for worst-case scenarios, spreading their resources thin and creating anxiety that affected their strategic calculations. Sometimes the unknown threat is more powerful than the known one. The fifth lesson is about the limits of any single technology. The F-117 was extraordinary, but it was not invincible. It could be detected under certain circumstances. It could be shot down, as Serbia proved. It was eventually surpassed by newer technologies. No weapon system remains decisive forever. The competition between offense and defense, between detection and concealment, continues eternally. Today's revolutionary capability is tomorrow's obsolete relic. I want to conclude by reflecting on what the F-117 meant for the people who flew it and maintained it. These were individuals who devoted years of their lives to a program they couldn't discuss, flying aircraft that officially didn't exist, preparing for a war they hoped would never come. The pilots developed extraordinary skills, flying complex night missions with precision that would have seemed impossible a generation earlier. The maintainers kept these temperamental aircraft operational despite demanding requirements and primitive conditions, working with toxic chemicals to maintain the radar-absorbing coatings, often without full knowledge of what they were handling. They all operated under a burden of secrecy that affected their families and their relationships. Pilots couldn't tell their wives what they flew. Maintainers couldn't explain why they came home exhausted and covered in chemical residue. When aircraft crashed and pilots died, the families couldn't be told the truth. The sacrifice couldn't be publicly acknowledged. When the F-117 was finally revealed to the public in November 1988, a carefully staged event where the aircraft was shown in a single grainy photograph, many of these people were able to acknowledge for the first time what they had been doing. But even then, much remained classified. It's only years later, as documents were declassified and participants began writing memoirs, did the full story emerge. I think there's something profound about that. About people doing extraordinary work that no one could know about, serving a cause larger than their own recognition. The bandits who flew the Nighthawk, the engineers who designed it, the maintainers who kept it flying, they all contributed to something genuinely historic without ever being able to take public credit for it. They built a machine that did the impossible. And in doing so, they changed the world. The F-117 Nighthawk was retired from active service in 2008, but occasionally, in the skies over the Nevada desert, observers still report seeing a strange angular shape against the stars and aircraft that officially doesn't fly anymore, conducting missions that officially aren't happening. Some of these sightings may be test flights, evaluating new technologies, or training pilots for other stealth programs. Some may be adversary training, giving American forces practice against stealth aircraft. Full truth remains classified. The Nighthawk is still keeping secrets, even in retirement. What we know is remarkable enough. Aircraft designed to be invisible. An aircraft that couldn't fly without computers holding it steady hundreds of times per second. An aircraft with no radar, no guns, no meaningful speed, and no defensive capability of any kind. An aircraft so secret that its own pilots couldn't acknowledge its existence for years. And yet this strange, unlikely machine rewrote the rules of aerial warfare, ended an era of inevitable attrition in air combat, and helped bring down an empire. When I look back at the F-117, I see an aircraft that embodied the best qualities of human engineering: creativity, persistence, and the willingness to challenge assumptions that everyone else took for granted. The engineers who designed it, the pilots who flew it, and the maintainers who kept it operational all contributed to something genuinely historic. They started with equations in an obscure Soviet physics paper. They ended with an aircraft that terrified Soviet generals more than any weapon in the American arsenal. The F-117 had no radar, it had no guns, it had no speed. But it had something more valuable than any of those things, something that made it the most feared aircraft of its generation. It had the power to be invisible. In warfare, the enemy you can't see is the enemy you can't defeat.